Chapter 4. "Morning," Mr. McTosh said. "You must be Hugh Pine. I've heard about you. How are you?" "I'm fine." "Good. It's a lovely day. Do you want some stamps?" "No, I want a word." Mr. McTosh leaned over his counter and looked at the little old man facing him. He looked very sharply and took a deep breath. Then he went into the back of the post office, found his glasses, and, putting them on, came back again. "Yes," he said slowly. "I thought so. So that's why we never see you in town. You don't need anything from the stores, and you don't need anything from me. You are a porcupine, and you live in the woods. You have everything out there you could wish for." "I need something," Hugh Pine said, "and I came to tell you about it. I need a word with you." "A word?" Mr. McTosh took off his cap and scratched his bald head. Then he tugged at his whiskers and put his cap on again. "A word, eh? I don't have many words. All I have is a lot of stamps." "I don't know what stamps are," Hugh Pine said. "You wouldn't want to know. There are so many of them, and they are all different, and they cost money. You don't want to know what money is, either. What's this word you want, Hugh?" Hugh Pine looked around. He was feeling a little desperate now, although he was usually a calm animal. He just went his own way, plodding along quietly through the woods, ripping a bit of bark here and there and looking for the places where he had ripped the bark before, because there might be a few drops of good sugary syrup to lick. Right now he wanted to lick something. He saw Mr. McTosh's axe standing against the counter, so he ambled up to it and licked the beautifully curved handle. It tasted salty, and if there's one thing porcupines like more than sugar, it's salt. Mr. McTosh waited. He sipped some coffee from the mug that had been standing next to the stamp book and swallowed. Then he narrowed his eyes behind his half glasses and watched as Hugh Pine, now through with licking, bared his big orange teeth. "Ho!" Mr. McTosh shouted. "You aren't going to eat that handle, are you?" Now, that was just what Hugh Pine had had in mind. "Have something else," Mr. McTosh said. "What would you like?" Hugh Pine looked around him. There were no trees in the post office, and no shrubs, and no mushrooms. But he did want to eat something. He had spent a lot of energy that morning. Mr. McTosh looked about, too. There was an old pair of boots in a corner. "Do you like boots?" he asked. "I usually go home for lunch, but there's nothing here but coffee and those boots. How about a boot and some coffee?" "Please," Hugh Pine said, and after Mr. McTosh had poured half his coffee into one of the boots, Hugh Pine ate it, crunching and tearing, smacking and slobbering. "There," Mr. McTosh said, when Hugh Pine was done. "Now what's the word you want with me?" Hugh Pine took a very deep breath. This was going to be the most difficult part of his expedition. If only Mr. McTosh could understand the grunts and garbles and little snorts porcupines used to express themselves. But of course he couldn't. So Hugh Pine took off his hat and put it on a chair and walked to the middle of the empty post office and began. He used the few words he had learned from listening to the loggers, and he made frantic gestures with his paws and stood on one leg. He got so excited he dropped to the floor and rolled over a few times, but he never stopped talking until he had said it all. "Yes," said Mr. McTosh a little later, when Hugh Pine was done. "Quite." Hugh Pine looked at Mr. McTosh. Mr. McTosh said. "They are stupid," said Hugh Pine. They can't walk upright, and they won't stick to the left side of the road because they can't remember what left is. And they don't have hats, and if they did have hats, the hats would fall off their heads. That's their trouble. Not your trouble, Mr. McTosh said. You are smart. Very, Hugh Pine said, and took a piece of the other boot. Mr. McTosh didn't have any coffee left, but there was still some cream, and he poured that into the boot. So what now? He asked. Don't know, said Hugh Pine. But I thought you said you were very smart. Hugh Pine stopped eating. He turned around and faced Mr. McTosh. His nearsighted eyes blinked as he stared at the old man who was leaning on the counter and whose white whiskers hung down onto his folded arms. I am a very smart animal, Hugh Pine said. But you are a man, and men are smart in other ways. The loggers say you are smarter than most, and you look a little like me, so... Hugh Pine sat down, using his thick bristly tail as a brace. His long dark hairs waved about in the draft that came through the crack of the door. He looked like he had never combed or washed in his life, but he also looked quiet and determined. Mr. McTosh grinned because it had suddenly occurred to him that looking at Hugh Pine was a little like looking in a mirror. Yes, Mr. McTosh said, we look alike, and we are both officials. They come to us when they are in trouble, and we take care of it. Not because we like to muddle around and do things, but because they expect us to do something. I have an idea. An idea? Hugh Pine asked. Like a word, the word you wanted to have with me. Go and find out which part of the woods the porcupines like best, and then come and tell me. A draft suddenly blew through the crack of the door, and the long hairs on Hugh Pine's back waved sharply, and all his spines came up, making him look much bigger. And then, Mr. McTosh said, I'll come out with some people, and we will build a fence, a good high fence, so that the cars can't get through it. Good, Hugh Pine said. Thank you for the boots and the coffee and the cream. He waddled to the door, and Mr. McTosh came and held it open for him. Must be more than 3 feet high, 4 feet maybe, Mr. McTosh said to himself as he watched Hugh Pine walking down the street, very straight under his big floppy hat. I am 5 feet, he thought, locking the post office door. He got into his car to drive home for lunch, and on the way home he saw a porcupine lying at the side of the road. He was about to drive on, but he stopped, turned back, and got out. Mr. McTosh stood at the side of the road and studied the dead porcupine. Amazing, he said softly. It looks like me. Same sort of face, whiskers and all. I never knew I looked like a porcupine. And I could understand Hugh Pine's talk, too. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. End of chapter 4.